Okay. Bells tell me when it's time to begin here, so I have to listen to them. I'm Benjamin Neely. I'm the Executive Director of the Berks History Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this morning. Thank you for coming out to join us for today's program. I just have a few announcements before we get started here. One, I see some Berks History Center member stickers. We always appreciate your membership. Thank you very much for the support. We hope you're having a good membership experience. If not, we want to hear about that too. But if you're not a member, we'd love to have you. We have a number of great benefits, including price breaks on a lot of our programming, but also we publish a quarterly magazine called the Historical Review of Berks County. And we've done that continuously since 1935. And it's a really nice publication, has a wide variety of articles in it. You never know what our authors are going to bring to us. So it is a really exciting edition. So if you're a history buff and you love local history, I really think you'd enjoy it, and we love having you. And you can join right online. We can help you do it out there in the lobby, and your day will be 10% better for having done it. Let's see here. On Saturday, February 15th, we have a workshop here. This is going to be led by our education curator, Vicki Hefner, and it's a Loomba parody crochet rag rug workshop. And so she'll take you through actually creating a rag. You don't have to have any skill to participate. She will get you going here. On Saturday, February 22nd at 10 a.m., we have a Theorem painting workshop with Peggy Allen, who's presenting today. So you'll be an advantage having been in this program to know exactly what you'll be doing. But the last workshop sold out. So I recommend that if you're interested that you do so quickly, and you can sign up online. Again, we can get you signed up here in the lobby. And there will be another such workshop, actually doing a different piece on April 5th. So I hope maybe you can join us for both or at least one of those programs. We have been teaching for a couple of years now the Pennsylvania Dutch language, and we have another semester starting in just a couple of weeks. There are still some spaces available. So we have beginner and intermediate classes in this semester. It is 8 weeks. They are online, but we also have an in-person session that will be on Wednesdays at 1 in the afternoon here in our classroom at the museum. So if you're interested in that, you should do it. If you've ever just been curious about it, you should do it. And our instructors are really great. And if you don't have a word of the language, it does not matter. You come in and you'll be made to be very comfortable. So it's a lot of fun, and it is a tremendous way to connect with your heritage. And there is a ton of history and culture baked into language and how it develops. And so I think you'd really be into that if you'd like to join us. We'd love to have you. So, and you can learn more about that. We have some literature out in the lobby, but you can also go to berkshistory.org, our website, and learn about it. And if you are on social media, we're on Facebook and Instagram, and we post our events and updates to these events all the time there. So follow us there and you will be up to date. After our program today, we do have a docent-led tour by Rick Politica there in the back. You meet him out in the lobby at 11:15, and he will take you on a docent tour through the museum. And even if you've been through the museum a couple of times, going with Rick is a different experience. And you have an opportunity to ask questions, but also he has a lot of stories and content that he can add to the exhibits as he goes through. So I encourage you to do that if you haven't done that before. We also have a new exhibit that opened, and it is called Sights Unseen, and it is back in our Palmer Gallery, and it is really neat. It is a collection of photographs that were taken by folks who were blind. And they were led by a professional photographer. This project happened in the 70s, and we have those on display there, and also a neat interactive to go through, and so that you can have an opportunity to guess at what it was that drew that person using their other senses to take a photograph. And then you can flip up the little tab and read and see if you were correct. So it's interesting to go through, and I hope you take an opportunity to do that while you're here today. And then I'd love to see you back here on Saturday, March 2nd, March 8th for our second Saturday program, which will be the restoration of the Drivebus Covered Bridge. And bridge historian Fred Moll will take us through the plans that they have to develop they've developed to restore the bridge. So that would be very interesting. But I thought I just had a few announcements, and I feel like I've been going on for a while. I want to introduce Peggy Allen here, and I have some of her background I'd like to read to you here. She is a Berks County native and owner of Heritage Art and Craft Studio, a mobile art studio, has devoted over 30 years to teaching art and crafts before establishing her own business in the 1990s. She worked in retail and marketing. While she offered a wide variety of classes, her passion lies in traditional American crafts. As a former Theorem artist and studio owner, she now teaches historic crafts and Theorem painting in 3 counties at various historic locations, including Berks History Center, Ephrata Cloister, Isaac Meyer Homestead, Landis Valley Museum, Historic Beidler House, Berks Heritage Center, and Historic Schaefertown. Her husband, Greg, also conducts numerous art, crafts, and natural educational programs at Berks Encore Strawstown and Fleetwood Centers, Spring Township Parks and Recreation, and the Nature Center. Furthermore, Peggy provides craft instruction to adults with intellectual disabilities for several Berks County groups. She stays informed of the current historic trends as a member of the Historical Society of Early American Decoration, Berks History Center, and Landis Valley Museum. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Peggy Allen.
Thank you so much to the staff, and for those of you who are online, we hope that this is going to be a very informative and educational program for you. If you don't know what Theorem painting is, you will by the end of our seminar. We have a lot of pictures to cover. Those of you sitting here, we do have theorems placed around. You're more than welcome to look at them after the presentation. And then also, if you think you would like to try your hand at theorem painting, we have a mini theorem that we're going to be teaching. It will take 15 to 20 minutes, and you do not need any experience. And it's a very, very small portrait, but it'll give you kind of an idea. So our seminar today is Centuries of Theorem Painting, and you're going to be surprised how far back this is going to travel, because theorem is stenciling, but in a whole unique way. I am not as real good with modern technology, so we're going to get started here. Oh, here we are. We're going to talk more about what theorem is, but for right now, we're going to go back on a journey on how stenciling eventually moved towards theorem painting. These pictures illustrate 3 different historical timelines on stenciling. The lower portion is caveman. Now you might wonder, why is this coming up? Well, they have found caves that had cave paintings, and they also found stenciled handprints that were done through hollowed bones, blowing pigments of paint over the hand to trace the outline. And this is not pictured, but I think this is relative into the history timeline. The Chinese invented paper stencils around 105 AD, and they were used in textiles, they were used to decorate Buddhist temples, and they were also used in porcelain. But stenciling became more widespread around the 1500s when it traveled through the trade routes in the Middle East and eventually moved to Europe. And part of that technique was learning how to cut stencils out of paper. The next section I want you to look at is the blue. This is a photo of an example of Chinese katazumi, and it is a mid-8th century method of dyeing fabric through rice paste. When it's removed, there is a reverse form of stenciling. And then our last picture depicts wall covering, made much like our wall covering, but this one was done in fabric. The invention of the printing press, mid-1400s, aided in the development of pattern books of stencils. These books circulated across Europe around 1500s and were used to create stencil patterns for fabric wall coverings in wealthy buildings such as churches and homes and other government buildings. But around the 18th century, the printing of these fabric patterns became prohibited to protect the silk industry. So instead of fabric, these stencil paper designs were invented on, well, they were invented as paper, and they were known as domino segments. So they came in small segments and they would have to be placed on the wall. If you really look at this picture, you're going to see a very opulent lifestyle. But more than that, if you notice the background, it has fabric wall covering. This is when it was still in vogue and only the very wealthy could afford it. But even more than seeing this is I want you to be aware of the lifestyle at the English and Europeans led. And you're going to find out that when the colonists came to colonial America, the lifestyle was very, very different, which we're going to discover right now. What a contrast, right? In the 1700s, many Europeans integrated to North America seeking religious and political freedom, as well as an improved lifestyle. However, they experienced multiple challenges in adapting to a new world and also establishing a new life in just about every aspect of living. And socially, they had to connect with three levels of social classes: the wealthy, the middle, and the lower class. However, after many years of struggle to survive and learn this new life, it did improve after the French and Indian War ended in 1763. And once the colonists were established and no longer facing survival, now they started to think more about their homes. This is a painter's box. I want to take you through what is in the painter's box. On the extreme left are primitive made stencil brushes. For those of you who have ever stenciled, you'll know that stencil brushes are flat. You can see that they are flat. Moving to the right lower is a stencil, most likely made of leather, perhaps tin. I think in this case it's leather. And you'll move over to the right and you'll notice it is the duplicate design of a pineapple. You see the stencil, then you can see the pineapple design. I think also in the back, you'll notice there's another stencil. I believe this one might have been tin because it looks like a little yellowed. But you'll notice that there are two smaller designs, not one big one, and we'll discover why in just a little bit. Remember I said that the colonists wanted to improve their life. Many of them didn't have artistic skills, so they would commission artists called itinerant artists. They would travel throughout the colonies, bringing their skills. I'm going to be talking about itinerant artists more often because they are a key to giving birth to theorem painting outside of an academic level. I do want to talk about the stencil brushes. They were made from animal hair, and then they were filled in either a wooden handle or sometimes a quill pen. A separate brush was used for any color, for each color. So you may have had 10 brushes with you. And actually in stenciling, today you still do the same thing. So you can tell that they had to carry a lot with them. Many of these itinerant artists traveled on horseback, some traveled on foot. They just couldn't go to a store and pick up paints. So they had to make their own. You can see by these pictures, there's different methods. Not only did they dye fabrics with these pigments, but they also dried them and grinded them down into a powder and then mixed them with natural binders such as egg, milk, linseed oil. They could make oil-based or they could make water-based paints, depending on what they mixed it with. It was quite a long process, so obtaining paints was no easy feat. It could also be boiled in water to produce dyes. Now, eventually, merchants got the idea that, oh, we can make our own, we can make paint, and then they would sell them to the itinerant artists, but it obviously didn't start out like that. And I also want to say that some of the paintings we even have here today, these contemporary artists of today still use some of these methods to obtain the exact colors that would have occurred back in early American art. Now, remember I said that the colonists were transitioning from a more simple lifestyle to a more grand way of living. They were looking to improve the aesthetic value of their home, and this is where stenciled walls came in. Most of the walls were plaster or they were made of wood, and they were very plain. They were very, very drafty. They just were dark. So stenciled walls became quite the thing. And although we don't know the exact origin of stenciled walls, we have found that there was one that was in Massachusetts dating back to 1778. Again, the itinerant artist comes into picture. They would be commissioned to do this work. They would be given a place to stay, food, and a small fee while they were there doing the work. But if you were a very wise homeowner, you would have the stenciler show his work in a closet or someplace out of the way to approve what the product was going to look like. Do you remember I said that there were smaller stencils in this artist box? There was a reason for that. Many of the stencils were made of nature items such as apples, leaves, tree trunks, vines, flowers. And what they could do with these very small stencils is they could arrange them in different designs and therefore come up with many different concepts. This became so popular in the way of stenciling that now it was time to be stenciling some of your household furnishings. We have two pictures here. One is a stenciled floor cloth, and then another is a stenciled chest. Actually, it's been documented that they believe that the floor cloths were the very first decorative item to be stenciled. Why? Because the floors were wide plank wood. They were drafty, they were cold, and they just looked very, very dull. So floor cloths took the place of very bare floors. This may not look like it fits, but it really does. I really want to focus in on the tremendous variety of artistic talent from these itinerant painters. During colonial America, these paintings represented your family, what you owned, what you did, and this could be passed on down through the centuries. You'll notice that this is a complete family. They usually had some sort of prop that meant something to their lifestyle. We see that the little girl has flowers. Maybe she enjoyed flowers. Maybe she worked out in the garden. You could see that the mother was of high society, and the father looking like he is a writer of some sort. And the little boy, we think, we're not quite sure, this might be a something to lead horses, because what you can't see is he's pulling a wooden horse. Well, this was known as folk art. Now, for those of you who know folk art, there are many, many different versions. This is just one of them. And it is referred to in this particular area because these paintings were made possible and available to people other than the wealthy, the common folk. Now, the artists that did these portraits really understood their local community and the more middle-class individuals and their way of life. And I want you to keep that in mind. They weren't just not doing things for the wealthy, but for all people. This understanding is going to be a bridge to theorem painting. So I give a lot of credit to itinerant artists. We're going to step aside and we're going to go to something else that's occurring at the same time. Do you remember we said that now they're paying more attention to their homes? Well, that also applied to the education of their children. Most children were homeschooled, but that wasn't enough. Young ladies needed to be groomed for marriage and for social status. So there was a popular new trend that came from England called boarding academies. And this is just one of them. This came from England. This is what's known as a trade card, much to what we would do today as a business card. And I'm just going to take time to read a little bit. Up at the top, this is from England, but this would have been similar to what would have been advertised in America. That it's a ladies' boarding school. You'll move on down and you'll see something is circled in red called needlework. And you're going to find out how important that was. And this was another introduction to theorem, and you'll find out why in the next slide. But in addition to needlework, which you notice the priority there, needlework first, then in smaller print, writing, music, dancing, and drawing. I don't see any math. Yay. I don't see any science. So this would indicate that these skills were very important. And the reason being, a young lady needed to be well-mannered and well-groomed for marriage. If you're going to run academies like this, you need to have skilled teachers. So many of the teachers came from Europe, bringing a lot of their customs, their social skills, and yes, their art skills. From about 1780 to 1820, and I find that this figure is phenomenal when you think about it, approximately 400 academies and boarding schools for young ladies were established in the colonies to provide education for middle and upper income families. Now you might wonder, well, where did the boys go? Their education was not as important as the women, because the women needed to be primed for marriage. The young boys most likely were helping out on the farm or helping father in a trade. But as we said earlier, it's interesting that artistic and social graces were more valued at the time than the academics. If you could not afford to go to one of these schools, then you were still being homeschooled. Needlework, we talked about that earlier. This is needlework sampler from a young girl. Any of you do needlework? You know that this is a very involved piece. This was a standard academic course because young ladies needed to know how to sew. It was very important. Well, not only did they need to know how to sew, but practicing samplers, you could tell your family's story. Things that were important to the family would show up. But it was also a way for them to learn the alphabet and also their numbers. But the problem was, depending on your skill level, depending on the design, it might take up to a month or more to complete. Now, try to give this kind of project to a child or a young lady today, you know what's going to happen. They want instant. You can imagine how long this took. And probably when it came to that, many of the young ladies preferred not to do it. Coming up next is theorem painting, and here's the reason why. Theorem painting was a popular art form introduced to America from England in the late 1700s, so it had been around. But it was said that it was so easy that even a child could do it. So any of you who are not sure you can do theorem painting, I guarantee you can do theorem painting, and you'll find out how easy it can be. So during this period of growth for the academies, theorem painting was introduced around 1820 as a curriculum to replace samplers because it was easier to do, it was quick, it was easy, and they could walk away with a painting in far less time. And remember, the colonists were looking to adorn their houses with something pretty. Theorem paintings were put into frames or hung on a wall, so this also was a dual purpose. Now, this isn't the best version of a theorem painting, as you will see later, but this is not bad for a young girl. It appears somewhat flat and oversaturated in color because this was done by a young girl. As they got better, the theorem paintings got better. Please keep something in mind because this is going to affect theorem. Not everybody excelled in this art form. This was considered inferior art. Whatever they were teaching in class, whether it was math or dancing or music, whatever it was, had to be excellent. And this ended up being inferior. So how did they do this? Well, there were pattern books from the 1800s on stencil designs. The teacher would trace the design and transfer it onto stiff varnished paper coated with linseed oil. And then she would use a penknife to cut out the designs. Students were asked to pick out whatever designs they want and arrange them in their own composition. I can tell you that this particular painting did not look like this. You may have had a pear stencil, or you may have had a grape stencil, and then it was up to the student to arrange it and stencil it. Remember I said that not all the paintings looked really good. Well, the theorem interest, which had held for several decades, started to decline because of inferior art. So like it is today, this faded out and a new trend came in. However, if it wasn't for itinerant artists and some of the European teachers who knew how to do this, the art form most likely would have vanished. But after it left the academic locations, I can't imagine all 400 got rid of them, but most of them did. It was no longer the trend. These educators and traveling artists, known as itinerants, started to teach. Anyone who was interested, it didn't matter if your social class, didn't matter if you were a young boy, a young man, an older man, it didn't matter if you were interested, it got taught. So we can thank those educators and itinerant artists for keeping this alive. There's more to the story though. Our focus is now going to be moving on to Theorem beyond its identification with school-aged artists, because that's really what it was known for. If you look in any history books, it'll tell you that. But there's a gray line, I mean, a very gray area. Well, what happened when it left? A lot of research went into this. So I will tell you, yes, the itinerant artists and also the educators helped to do this. It really was more of a female art as opposed to attracting men, but we will learn later on, there are a few men that did this artwork that we're going to credit for bringing this art form back during the America's bicentennial. Theorem developed a lot more ornate. You can see in this picture here, this is an early 19th century peacock. Back in the days, it was okay to copy patterns. There was no copyright laws. This particular design has appeared on other things, purses, sachets, bell pulls, in different, in different colors, in different sizes, but it was okay to copy patterns. And in those early years of theorem painting in the academies, it was more about how to use the materials, less about originality. So it didn't matter if you copied. This is a stencil. It doesn't look like a stencil. It looks like it was hand painted. But I want to explain a little bit about theorem painting while we're here. How many of you have done stenciling at home or here? You know when you stencil, yes, you know when you stencil, there are something called bridges, and that's where the stencil cutout meets another cutout, and there is a bridge. Otherwise, the entire design would be falling through. In this design, you don't see any bridges. And the reason being is that all these stencils, and even today, had its own component. So let's look at something here. We're going to start from left to right. You see the melon? It has different shape, 2 different colors. Then we move on to, I believe this looks like a part of an apple. Then it moves on to a peach. Then it moves on to a lemon. Each of those shapes will have its own cut stencil. It may not be all on the same page, but it was individually placed so that when you have a stencil, you very, very carefully put it right next to the stencil you just did, and you now stencil that design. So there was a precision to it. It was a very meticulous applying one stencil at a time with a brush that was designated for the color. It was actually called formula painting because it follows a formula. I like to say it was like painting by numbers, except using a stencil. Because it does get why I still don't understand it. moving forward, you will know more about it. Fruit compositions, by the way, was everybody's favorite. The reason being is because you had wide open spaces in your stencil to be able to move colors around. You can see that there is a color, and then there might be another color of adding some shading. So fruit compositions were the easiest. People loved doing them. You'll also notice that it's in a basket. Fruit flowers usually appeared in either a vase or a basket on top of something like a tabletop. This looks like it was part of a table scarf. Also on marble, they would create something that looked like marble. And then finally, the end part of any of your stencil designs, and even today, is adding detail. In this case, you'll notice that the leaves have veins in them. And you see these swirls up at the top. They're known as tendrils. They're meant to look like vines that help to add some, some beautiful expression that's supposed to look more like a, it's for real. It has depth to it. It increases the size of your painting. So there's all kinds of things that it does to engage in a beautiful portrait. Another interesting thing was they would add butterflies or bees. Artists loved to do that. It was easy to do, and you could add all kinds of handmade detail. Now, the next one I want you to study, I'm going to be quiet, and I want you to just study this, and then we'll talk about it. That is a stencil. And when I show this, people just cannot believe it was a stencil. This was not a very common theme. Most of your stencil designs came from birds, animals, fruits, flowers, but the scenery was a lot more difficult to do because the stencil pieces and components of putting it together were very, very small and took a lot of work and also a lot of hand detail. The scenes usually represented areas of mourning, to give memorial to a loved one. What's missing in this picture is you see that they're grieving over a tombstone. The artist would then put in the name of the individual who passed away and most likely the year. Also represented would be landscape. I have a Theorem at home that has actually a castle on it. It is not a mourning picture, it's a landscape. Also biblical designs, especially Noah's Ark. And then we're going to move on to the flowers. Again, the themes were fruit, birds or animals, flowers, and scenery. This theorem is called Four Seasons. And I should say that sometimes the theorems were created with a purpose. It was significant. Other than just looking pretty, it may have meant something to the artist. This is based on the four flowers appearing from each season. Now, a copy of this is actually a copy of the original, which was done around the 1800s. The original is on display at the DeWitt Wallace Gallery in Williamsburg. It's beautiful, isn't it? What I'm going to show you now is going to shock you. This is the picture. This is the pattern. Take a minute to look at that. And you can see why I say painting by numbers, but using stencils. Let's just look at the bowl itself. I don't know if people sitting here can see it, but I'm sure a home audience can. You'll see alternating numbers in the striped area of 1, 2, 1, 2, and the pattern repeats itself across the bowl. That would indicate that number 1, everything that's numbered 1 in that bowl would be on stencil 1. All these individual cuts would be on stencil 1. The artist would do stencil 1, remove it, and then bring stencil 2 in to line up precisely next to it, not showing any gaps. So you see how it is a formula. It's not just random stenciling, it does follow in a numerical order. And then likewise, at the bottom of the bowl, you'll see 3, 4, 3, 4, the same effect. Now, sources of patterns today are available, but on very limited basis. It's my hope that theorem painting comes back, but until such time, you can get patterns from organizations like the Historical Society of Early American Decorations, otherwise known as HSEAD. But it is very hard to find patterns. I would not recommend you start off with this one. Now I'm going to show you stencil 1 of this exact painting, and there it is. I like the fact that the paint is still on here because then you can see, going back to the stripes on the bowl, you can see there is pattern 1, 1, 1, 1, and then the area that has the blue, which is the stencil, would be your area 2, 2, 2, 2. And you can see that there's very, very small lines. You have to be extremely careful with doing your stenciling. I do have that stencil here, by the way. Unfortunately, the audience at home will not be able to see me demonstrate it, but I do have it here. Let's move on into contemporary artists of today. What I like about this is not only is this the artist, she was local, she was from Lidditz, her name was Sandra Coldren, but some of you know her and some of you have taken classes from her. The more contemporary artists of today have brought in other subjects that were not popular in the early American tradition, such as the disselfink, the tulip. Images of fractor start to appear on theorem paintings and became very, very likable. Collectors, in fact, are still looking for those kinds of pictures. Many of them are on eBay. Some of them you can even buy at some of these art shows. But she incorporates a lot of the colonial with German artwork. She's not the only one to do that. By the way, I forgot to mention up at the top is a peacock. This is a very good example of folk art meets early American design. Folk art, again, defined in many, many ways, usually is very ornate, very colorful, and sometimes with whimsical images. This basket of flowers is on top of a table scarf or on top of leaves and a table scarf, because you can see that the leaves and then underneath is green, so it is part of a table scarf. But they over exaggerate, which is a beautiful art form on a lot of the folk art. And you'll notice that there are up at the top, there are plenty of butterflies. Looks like a butterfly and perhaps a bee, I'm not quite sure. But it's bringing the two images together into one, and this is more of a contemporary design. Continue with a folk art style of theorem painting. I own a work from both of these artists. The one on the right is a rooster design from Bill Rank. He was born in 1921. He is deceased. He was a distinguished Bucks County folk artist, one of the few men, perhaps, that do this work. And on the left is a work by David Ellinger. You notice any similarities? You'll notice that both of them are standing on a mound. Both of them have flowers on either side. Both of them happen to be facing the same direction, but a whole different interpretation. Many artists copied each other, but this would make sense because the artist on the right studied with the artist on the left. So obviously he was able to study under David Ellinger and learned the David Ellinger look. We're going to talk about these men a little bit later on because they play a significant role around 1976 by America's bicentennial. This is a picture of David Ellinger, and to the right is his trademark. He would sign his paintings on the back with something that looks like a Pennsylvania Dutch design. David Ellinger was born in 1913. Of course, he's no longer with us. He was born in Philadelphia and moved to Trapp. As a matter of fact, Trapp has some of his original artwork on display. His paintings and theorems are in 14 museums throughout the United States. But he never considered himself a painter. He was an antiques and art dealer, and he painted to support that trade. I had the privilege of meeting David and helping him set up a show. At that time, back in 1980, I had no idea what a theorem was, but I was fascinated by his artwork. Very humble man, didn't speak much. Today, his paintings at auction can go to $35,000. I'm sorry that we cannot show that painting to our home audience, but I can tell you that it is here with us, and the folks attending will be able to see the painting. You can also go online and look up David Ellinger, and you'll get to see some of his work, and it's really amazing. We're going to go right back to the beginning. We have one more section to cover here about theorem. You have an idea now on the beautiful, beautiful artwork and how long it took, not only in this kind of form, but if any handcrafted art, even right here in the museum. Do you know it almost disappeared? The public lost interest during America's Industrial Revolution. It was around the period of the mid-19th century through the 20th century. And for those of you who are not familiar, it's when mass production occurred in factories and took away interest of handcrafted art. It was easier to gain access through the American Revolution to products and services, and easier to make things. But thanks to the thanks to the arts and craft movement, it was created in response to the Industrial Revolution. And its sole purpose was to revive and promote handcrafted work. Because of their efforts, a new public interest started to come back, which happened between 1920 and 1930. Thanks to influential people like Abby Aldrich Rockefeller and many others who bought these large collections and decided to make them public, it started to change the public perception of returning back to traditional handmade arts and crafts. These showings went to galleries and historic locations. If any of you have ever been to Williamsburg, one of the largest museums for collections is the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Museum in Williamsburg. I was privileged to be there at the time that they had introduced their theorems, many of them dating back to the period that we talked about. So by the late 1970s, something happened again in America. We were approaching the bicentennial, and people started to take interest again. Stenciled walls, learning crafts, these great big shows, these juried art shows, people were starting to take an interest. And stenciling enjoyed a comeback. In fact, many of you probably had stenciled your walls. You probably regretted stenciling your walls, but many of the walls were stenciled. A lot of the classes, there were workshops. But theorem painting also became popular again, thanks to public classes, education, and our two artists, Bill Rank and David Ellinger, were credited for bringing this back also. So it's really remarkable that being more of a female trade, that two men who were well known helped to revive this art. I'd like to conclude by saying today there are only a few nationwide organizations and mostly historic museums that are trying to revive and keep this art form alive. It's not something you're going to find at your local craft show or going in and buying supplies at your local Michael's or any other art company. Next year is America's 250th anniversary. It is my hope that we return to some of this art, that there will be a renewed public interest. We thank places like Berks History Center for making this possible so that this art form does not completely fade or die. So we hope that you've had a little bit of an education. If you knew something about Theorem, maybe you know more about its history. And also, I want to encourage you to be looking for theorems. I do have a story to tell you from one of our students. She didn't know what a theorem was, but she's now taken 4 classes. And she was in an antique store and she saw a theorem. She knew what it was. How do you tell what a theorem is? They're usually done on velvet. It has a different look. The velvet creates that nice soft look and it's dense enough to absorb the paint. She purchased it and brought it to my theorem class and proudly showed it. And people were like, where did you get this? Because they're hard to find. She saw another theorem and reported to me that theorem was not very good. She actually knew what to look for in a theorem. So that's one person who has become educated on theorem. We hope all of you will too. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here and learn about theorem painting.